Hello, everyone. I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX, and really excited to bring to you today the third and final in our conversation series on the future of humanitarian action in partnership between DevX and the Hilton Foundation. This is a prelude to the big Hilton Humanitarian Prize, which will be given away in a ceremony just later this week. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But this session today is really connected in many ways to this year's prize recipient, Homeboy Industries, because we're diving into the issue of gang violence, particularly zoning in on Central America. You know, we're very used to thinking about this issue of gangs in Central America. It's been a headline issue, and people in the development and humanitarian industries certainly know of it. But what we may not realize is the degree to which it is shaping the life and the future for many of these societies and communities. In fact, there are statistics from earlier this year that show there are more people, civilians, killed in violent criminal activity in places like Honduras and El Salvador than in countries like Somalia or Yemen, places where we're quite used to thinking about conflict as a major humanitarian issue. And so we're really excited to bring a discussion to you today that's very much grounded in the realities of the region. And to help us do that, we've got our reporter, Teresa Welsh, who I want to welcome to the conversation today. Teresa, welcome.
Hi, Raj. So good to be talking to you today.
Great to talk to you. I'm really excited to hear your session that's upcoming because you're a reporter at DevX who people may know this if they follow your byline, who covers the region in general. You've spent time in Colombia, on the border with Venezuela, in Central America. You've covered on the ground development and humanitarian issues in the region. You've also covered a lot about fragile states and food systems, nutrition. So you've got a wide beat, but this is a region you really spend a lot of time paying attention to.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really excited for this conversation to really dive in on some of these issues, particularly as it pertains to Central America. And the issue of gang violence really is central to these societies, and it does have a massive impact on the humanitarian situation because the general security in these countries is going to impact the availability as well as the success of any other humanitarian interventions that we might be talking about.
And it connects so well to this year's Hilton Humanitarian Prize because this is the first time in 25 years, it's the 25th anniversary of the prize, the first time it's being given to a US-based organization, an organization that primarily works in the US, Homeboy Industries, based in Los Angeles. And most of the people that Homeboy serves are people who come from a gang lifestyle or gang community or come out of a gang or out of incarceration. And it kind of highlights the fact that the SDGs are designed to be universal. They apply to every country, rich and poor, that these issues are universal, that gang violence is affecting many places around the world and probably nowhere more so than Central America.
Yeah, and I think we often don't think about that, right? We talk at DevX so much about the SDGs, and we don't necessarily think that much about how they're applicable here in our own country. But obviously, we can see these ties to everything that's going on in Central America. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation with a couple of folks that really are experts in this issue to hear about not only their personal experiences, but the work that they're doing, particularly with youth in schools. Obviously, COVID-19 is impacting everything that's being done right now, and as well as hearing their perspectives about what's the way forward. Gang violence has been such an issue in this region for decades, unfortunately, and how are we going to move ahead?
Yeah, I'm really eager to hear about that too. I understand the issue and the level of severity, but what do we do about it is something I'm really eager to hear in your conversation. Just tell us a little bit more about who you're about to speak with.
Yeah, so I'm going to be chatting with Selena de Sola. She's with Glasswing. She's based in El Salvador. The organization began there, but they do work throughout Central America. And they really have a holistic approach to thinking about the impacts of violence and trauma. They do a lot of school-based intervention with youth and children to help them think about the way that the society they're growing up in is impacting how they think about themselves as well as their own futures, and working to equip kids with the tools to overcome all of those obstacles. And then I'll also be chatting with Roberto Loao, and he is a journalist and author, Salvadoran as well. And he'll be telling us about his personal experience with, some gang activity, violence, and sort of how he learned about his own family's personal history and how that impacted the way he saw his own life and how he sort of moved out of those behaviors. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation to hear a little bit about sort of the historical impact, which you cannot ignore when you're talking about this issue, as well as where we're at today and where we might be going.
Really interested to hear the discussion. Can't wait, and I'll see you on the back end of it.
Excellent. Thanks so much for joining us today for this conversation. I'm really excited to have with me here Selena De Sola, who's the co-founder and vice president of programs with Glasswing, and Roberto Loado, who is an author and co-founder of Dignidad Literaria. Welcome to you both. I'm so excited to be having this conversation. We are here to talk about violence, specifically in Central America. And I would love to really get into the meat of that with you both. I think particularly here in the United States, we really only have a surface level understanding of what is happening in Central America with regard to gang violence. And it's not covered super in depth in the mainstream media. And so I'd like to hear from you both. What more do people need to know to fully understand this issue? Selena, I'll go to you first.
I think there needs to be an understanding, definitely, you know, that this is an issue. It's an issue of human impact. It's an issue. It's treated so much as this conversation around crime and behaviors and whether you're a good person or a bad person. And I think what's really important is to understand why, you know, the conditions that lead to people being in situations where, you know, involved in lives of crime and violence. So it's just taking this away from the person and understanding what contextual factors there are and what injustice there is essentially that results in so many people being exposed to trauma and violence over the course of their lifetime.
Thanks so much, Roberto.
I can't really follow up that excellent answer from Selena, but let me try. And thank you for inviting me, by the way. I'm honored to be with you all. The other thing I would add would be that we have to you mentioned the surface understanding, but without understanding the issues, they can't really be dealt with, right? That's just fundamental to social science, humanitarian work, or whatever. So to understand, in the case of Central American gangs and Central American violence, you have to understand the history of violence, the transition, for example, from a primarily agricultural society that went to war, that went on to become now 70% urban. And so these patterns, and in the United States, we don't have an understanding of that. That's why I wrote my book, Unforgetting, right? 30 years of experience, because of the fact that the gangs in El Salvador and Central America were born in Los Angeles, California, where I lived and worked in the early 90s with some of these youth. And we had programs that were trying to draw youth away from the kind of at-risk behavior that I used to have as a kid growing up here in California myself, as a child of Salvadorans, working class and poor. And so, you know, there's an element of, you know, kind of escalating the violence and the patterns that are not good for a lot of us in terms of the policing and government policy. That's something else. Besides understanding, we have to understand the role that government, policing, and even military policy has played in exacerbating violence in the region.
Yeah, and Teresa, just to add to that, I think understanding the intergenerational aspects of exposure to violence and trauma, you know, so going along with what Roberto said, it's not just it's a genetic thing too. I mean, this exposure to violence over generations and the fact that there aren't systems in place to mitigate the exposure to trauma and violence are fundamental, and they're often left out of this conversation. That is sometimes, you know, it's oversimplified, and it's a criminalizing of people, with that lack of understanding of contextual factors, frankly neurological factors, right, like the science around violence and trauma.
Yeah, and I think that is something that we don't love to talk about here in the U.S. and definitely doesn't make it to the headlines, right? The U.S. government's role in creating all of these issues, which is obviously substantial in and of itself, and we don't have time to get into all of that today. But I think that is important for our audience to keep in mind that there are lots of regional factors that play into this, and the science is a really interesting piece of this, Selena. The work that you guys do, focuses a lot on the psychological impacts of trauma and how this impacts communities. Tell us a little bit more about your work in that space and why it's so important to have that in mind when we're talking about these issues.
We started working 13 years ago. We started here in Salvador, where I am now, and now we work regionally. But interestingly, we started with this focus on, kids only go to school for 4 hours a day in the public system. They don't really have access to these extracurricular programs, and kind of we went on this path of like social and emotional learning and just mentorship and looking at these big brother big sister and these models that existed, and going directly into the communities that face the most stigma and marginalization, and quickly I think we realized that there's really no attention being paid. And interestingly, now during COVID, there's more, but the issue of trauma and mental health were just completely absent, and they have been completely absent. And now, people talk about it more around the kind of dinner table. But really, I think when we're working in communities, we're looking at identifying how we can develop protective factors in kids, to address, kind of reduce the risk factors. And that means asking a lot of questions and talking to young people, talking to kids, talking to families, and saying, well, from number one, what does well-being look like to you? And what do you think we need to do to be able to contribute to what that means to you? And number two is, how do you build, I guess, more like trauma-informed ecosystems? How do you build, help provide people with the tools to understand how and I think we all need these tools, right? Like just how exposure to trauma affects us, affects our behavior, affects us physiologically, how we can seek support, how important healing is. In fact, it's probably the most important thing, and that healing isn't something that needs to be done in a psychiatric hospital. You don't need medications. Like, this is about community. It's about social fabric. It's about that scaffolding that's not just built by others from the outside, but it's built by the person who's climbing up that structure, So I think there's a lot, it's about hope, and it's, so there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had. The important thing is when you do understand the science, it's not like you're gonna have these like super technical conversations with every person you talk to about it, but it helps you understand. I mean, when we work in the public schools on, prevention, primary prevention, but we also work in hospital-based prevention. And once you've gone, you've survived a gunshot wound, you want to understand why you're hypervigilant, why you're hyper aroused, why you feel like you're going crazy. So understanding that is power, right? And that makes you realize that you're not a bad person, that you're not crazy, and that things can change. And so I think it's the science is important for that. It's for us to really take it away from the bad person who did a bad thing and understand how much of this can be addressed, and I think that gives hope, and I think that gives us opportunities to really be more rigorous about the way we do work, and be more rigorous about who we're accountable to, which is the young people we work with. In our case, adults, young people, the families.
And Roberto, your work has looked at the multi-generational impact of this, and how violence and trauma connect these generations and really are a part of people's stories. Tell us a little bit about that, and why we need to keep the generational impacts of this in mind when we're thinking about how to solve these issues today.
Yeah, I really want to echo what Selena was saying about the, approaching the problem in these multidisciplinary ways and looking at it intergenerationally. I use my own story in my book to tell the story, because most of the book is in the present time, in 2015, when I'm in these clandestine hideouts with the very top leadership of MS-13 and 18th Street. But then I'm trying to understand what's underneath, what turns a child into a violent gang member. And I go back to my own past, and also to that of my father, because my father has this astonishing secret that that he never knew about, that has to do with something that happened in 1932, La Matanza, a massacre of somewhere between 10 to 30,000 indigenous people that basically inherited onto me what I call an atomic bomb of trauma that I carried that I didn't even know about. And I became a crazy kid. And so I have a long 30 years of dealing with these issues. And I watched after the war as the gangs were born. And I never knew why I did the crazy things that I did, whether joining the clique or joining the Frente, until afterward. And I learned about my dad's secret, which is what I kind of go into in my book. I discovered this truly astonishing thing in my life. And I think readers will find it astonishing too. And so, I wanted to make that contribution to the work, because we won't simply get out of this by policing our way. It's a proven failure in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in the United States. There are proven ways to deal with these problems, which involve anything from, a battery of programs where you remove tattoos, you get a job training, you do arts, you do psychology, you give psychological services. And I encourage people to look at the work of somebody and the things that branched off from the work of Ignacio Martin Baró, who came up with this idea of liberation psychology, that rather than look at it from the kind of psychologist and patient thing, it takes the weight of the war and the trauma off of the patient and onto the society as a whole. And it's a very different approach that I've found effective in the places that I've worked, whether it's here or in El Salvador.
And you talk about the importance of understanding the role of policing and law enforcement in this, and how that has widely not been an effective response to all of the issues we've seen. When we try to think about this from a humanitarian lens, what's a better way for either law enforcement, or perhaps we take law enforcement out of this? What should the responses to these communities be, Roberto?
Right now, I can't tell you the exact. I'd have a PhD thesis written if I could, and I would gladly contribute that to humanity. What I will say is that this is a big problem. People don't want to talk about this in El Salvador. It's the third rail of the gang issue right now. Is people don't want to engage in talks about peace, which is, I think, problematic. There has to be. So I think humanitarian organizations can do a lot to remind society of the necessity of peace and the mindset and the heart set of peace.
And Selena, how do you think about this issue with your work, primarily with youth, with young kids? How do you think about the way that they interact with law enforcement in their lives and the role that all of this plays in gang violence?
I mean, yeah, I think the relationship with law enforcement is really, I think Roberto has been speaking about it, and it's complex. And I do think if we don't address that effectively, I think it'll be really hard to address this issue in a comprehensive way. I think there's so many different interventions, right, that can be done. And I think when you think about this as a human issue, as a humanitarian issue, a lot of times everybody wants a sustainable solution to this, and a sustainable, the use of that kind of the word sustainability. And I think, that's where you have to kind of look at sustainability, but you also have to look at what it is to be humanitarian. And when you look at a crisis of this sort, and frankly, it's expensive work. This isn't, I'm sure, organizations in the US like Homeboy and organizations here, we work in this is a lot of work, because it does take, when you think about trauma and healing, and I think there's a World Health Organization statistic that if you've survived violence, you're 5.5 times more likely to perpetrate, right? And this is anybody. And then there's also the risk of victimization, of re-victimization. So, if you really look at the science, when you perpetrate, you've probably survived, you've been a victim, you've survived some sort of violence yourself, and understanding that, and understanding the importance of that healing. And I think that requires the community-based approaches, right? So it requires, working in schools, working with children when they're little, and not saying I'm going to work in and I don't think constantly also saying, this is a community, a gang affected community. We're working with young people. We're working with communities that face, much fewer access to opportunities. Yeah. Do they have family members, or are they in gangs? For us, it's like, look, people deserve opportunities. And I think when you're in these communities, at least the kids we talk to, they're tired of just being categorized, whether they're a community with or without gangs. It's not, it's not about that. It's about young people. It's about their parents. It's about their families. And I think the community-based approaches, and I was taking some notes here too, because I think it's also about making sure that public schools, public hospitals, when someone arrives in a hospital with a violent injury and they look a certain way, whether they have tattoos or they look a certain way, that the healthcare personnel are going to continue to, they say in Spanish, violentar. Like, if you continue to stigmatize and to mistreat people because of your perception of what someone looks like that is just a bad person or a dangerous or violent person, you're perpetuating this constant aggression. And I think anybody who's in a situation that's survived violent injury, if you're able to work with institutions, work with healthcare providers, work with frontline workers, first responders, healthcare providers, teachers, to understand what it means to be trauma informed, I think you can start building the institutional capabilities that you need, because you can't just have one intervention. You can't just work in reintegration. You can't just work in the prisons. And I think we work with, here in El Salvador, with the Centro de Inserción Social Femenino, which is the only girls' juvenile detention center, essentially. And for us, it's like, we want to understand, like, how do you end up here, right? Like, really kind of gather that experience and understand, how do you end up here and what conditions need to be met for you to not end up here? Because, by the way, perpetuating violence is as traumatic as surviving violence. Like, the impact on your brain and on your body is just as bad. Nobody enjoys inflicting pain on other people, like maybe like a minuscule proportion of sociopaths. But anyway, I think it's just understanding this restorative vision, because law enforcement and punitive measures we've seen, like Roberto said, over and over again, it doesn't work. And looking at the science, does cognitive behavioral therapy work? Does mindfulness work? What works? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what we do know is communities are key to healing. And so if they have the knowledge, which they already have the wisdom, but if they have the science and the knowledge, it's a different approach. It's a more constructive and purposeful approach.
And you talk a lot about the stigma that is in communities, whether it's someone going into a hospital and, people there might have views about who that person is or is not, as well as in these tight-knit communities in smaller areas or in particular neighborhoods of the bigger cities. How are people supposed to, how do you address this issue when you have that so ingrained in the society? And how can we think about trying to move past that? And it really is a major mental switch. Roberto, I mean, as you talked about, it's decades of trauma. How can we move past that and work on changing the way that everyone in a community thinks about these issues?
Well, you've asked me another PhD question I can't really answer, but let me try my best. You can't policing in the home and policing by the state are proven failures. And they generate, I think, culture that is undergirding the inhumane practices of both. And so you have, for example, in El Salvador, you have polls that say a good 30 to 40% of people support exterminating the gangs. Okay, now that goes back to unresolved trauma at a societal level from the genocide that I described from the 1930s and from the war. I've been to the mass grave sites where, they haven't been excavated from 1932. They haven't largely been excavated from the war. And right near some of the ones from the war, the mass graves from the war, you have the mass graves of the gangs. Now, I've been to these sites. And so these mass graves are, I think, indicators of unresolved, not just trauma, but unresolved impunity, right? Individual government, so that you have structures that allow people to get away with murder, literally. And so, we have to look at and educate the broader society. I think one of the things humanitarian groups can do is broadly educate about this works, this doesn't. And it may put them at a confrontational role with the state. And I think we've reached a point where we need to do that. And I think we need to feel urgency about this, because if you don't have a gang problem right now, wherever you are, it may be coming, because your country is becoming increasingly urbanized, and the urbanization is being accelerated by climate change. I've been to Juarez, Mexico, when it was at its most violent moments. I've been near the border with Syria as a journalist, and I've been in El Salvador, and I've interviewed scientists who tell you that underneath the violence is the influence of climate change. It's not cause and effect, but when you have flooding in the rural area, when you have drought, when you have different effects of climate change, fires destroying the habitable space, you're going to get migration from the country to the city. And that's going to put a pressure on resources, and those kinds of pressures tend to increase violence, according to the scientists that I've spoken to around these different areas. And so, we have to have some urgency, and we have to be able to realistically confront the false narratives, because, like you said, Teresa, that there's the real issues, and then there's what's reported. And I see this as a journalist. A lot of what's reported doesn't reflect what things like Selena and I have experienced with direct contact. You have to have the voice of the person you're trying to impact in your service model, in your advocacy model, or it's going to fail.
Yeah, can I tell you a little, going along with what Roberto was saying, I want to do two things, because I think, one thing is that things can change. I think there's this perception that once you're in this category, you're in a gang, that's it. You're in a gang and you're a bad person, and that's the end of the story. There's no change. There's no way, the individual can change. And I think I want to give you two very specific stories. And one is that he's now one of my colleagues, but we were in Guatemala in one of the colonias that has very high rates of violence. And he had been going to a couple different schools and expelled. And so he was at kind of that last school, like that school where the kids who have gotten in trouble and they end up at that kind of the school that, that's like for kids who get into trouble. And our coordinator at the time decided she would go recruit volunteers from that school. She wanted the volunteers to be from that school. And so she recruited like 6 kids, and she said, we need you because you guys are going to be the role models for younger children in this primary school. Anyway, fast forward, 12 kids signed up, and 6 of them continued past 2 years as volunteers every week. And one of them was becoming like, he was, just constantly volunteering. And then he was, I think he was at the school at the time, but it turns out his sister, who had been involved in, gang or lies, she'd been involved in, or at least, involved, meaning whatever that means, whether they're friends with, there's so many different relationships that one can have, because at the end of the day, the gangs are also about relationships and loyalty and everything. But his sister was shot and killed in front of her children. And he tells you the story. He's like, I lost my mind. He's like, I went home and I wanted to open the drawer. I wanted to take out my gun because I knew who had killed her, and I was going to go get my revenge. And he said at that moment, he had his hand, right? He was going to get the weapon. And then he said he started thinking about like the kids that he had been volunteering for 2 hours a week. And all he could think about was, what if I'm in the newspaper and the kids who look up to me every week allow me to come, facilitate the glee club or whatever he was involved in. And that kind of accountability as a leader in his community kept him from doing that. He's like, I can't do that. I can't let these kids down. And so for me, I think we have to remember that the human part of all of this, and that and that I think engaging people in community as leaders in different ways is really really fundamental in transformation. And forgiving and moving back and giving more chances and more chances. And subsequently, I mean, he kept volunteering. Now he works for us. He's the school coordinator. So you can identify these leadership capabilities. And I think it's just opening up to that and understanding that people do have that human potential and taking that restorative focus as opposed to a punitive focus, you know. And then the other I think that I wanted to mention is we were doing this study, a randomized control trial on character strengths. And so of course you look at the science and we're like, the evidence shows that you need collaboration, communication, you know, all the things that we know, that we read about. And then we said, let's ask the students. So we have the ones that we know that are good based on the evidence globally. And then we asked the students, and we looked at the character strengths that, like Seligman, there's like a whole slew of them. And we asked them, and the first character trait that they picked, which we had not included, because the others, we had them nailed. They picked hope. They picked hope as a character strength, you know? And so for me, that's, when you think about it, you're like, of course they're gonna pick hope. But when you're looking sometimes, which is, I wanna say, you know, I'm bringing this into the human part because these teenagers that we work with in the schools felt that hope took precedence over so many other character strengths that we may think are what people need. And I think it's also reflective of that desesperación, that, you know, that lack of connection or the isolation. And that's the kind of stuff that when you think about humanitarian, we have to take that into account. Hope is a fundamental part of human connection, of thriving, of thinking about your future. So when you don't think about the future, and, you know, Roberto was talking about this trauma and what his dad went through, if you don't perceive that you have a future and you don't have hope for that, it's very difficult to navigate a very adverse context and still come out, oh, I'm going to be a great student, I'm going to learn math. You know, it's really hard. Cognitively, it's hard, and emotionally, it's hard. So I wanted to mention those two because I think it just brings it back to the human part of this and the humanitarian lens and the restorative lens that we really need to think about.
Yeah, those are really great examples. And I think it does remind us as well that, you know, often, like you were saying earlier, we have this perception that, you know, you are your crime or your violent act or whatever it may be, and there's no redemption possible for you beyond that. And, you know, the work of Glasswing and many others have proven, of course, that's absolutely not true. And when you have this mentality of, you know, being able to think about communities having redemption from these issues and people being able to recover, and it really shows you that obviously progress can be made. And Selena, I'd love to hear from you about how you guys sort of see the work that you do with specific groups reverberate throughout the community. You know, a lot of your work is school-based with children. And, you know, do you see impacts of that in their households, in their neighborhoods, communities, and sort of seeing the tactics that the children are learning in your programs reach those that maybe you had not intended to be your direct recipients, but you're seeing sort of a benefit to them anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work, we leverage the school as a center of community. That being said, a lot of kids are not in school, right? So we have been looking more and more about how, you know, looking more and more at how, and frankly, sometimes the schools don't want kids who are not in school coming to the infrastructure of the school. So a lot of our work is with parents. We do a lot of work in restorative practices through community cafes, through different engagement mechanisms. And I think also the students, for example, we're looking at masculinities, and the students will ask us, can this be taken out of the school? Because I can only, you know, I can shift my paradigms and my behaviors, but when I get home, it's not that easy. So a lot of the work, it is important. And I think the volunteerism, most of the volunteers we have that commit 2 hours a week year round are actually from the communities. And I think that part of it is really important. I think it's critical because when you feel like you can contribute something, and you don't have to contribute financially, but you can contribute your time, it really puts you in a position where, you know, it's a powerful position to be in. You see the way you're impacting kids' lives, not just your kids, but others. So I definitely think, and also our work with, when we needed, you know, we kept seeing kids were exposed to violence, or when there were homicides in schools, or parents or teachers, which happens. We needed to go through these processes because you can't talk about the crime, and Roberto mentioned impunity and all these other things. When you can't talk about the crime, it doesn't mean that you're not affected by it. So we were trying to identify ways to bring the community in to acknowledge the impact, emotional impact, without talking about the incident necessarily. So one of our students, his parents were killed and he saw it. We're not going to talk about the incident, but we're going to talk about how we feel, right? Like how they feel. And I think I should say we're not going to talk, the students. So you're able to talk about the emotional implications of what's happening to you. And I think if you don't get parents, teachers, and other community members involved, it's not possible. And even the clinics, you know, a lot of the patients we were seeing in hospitals, now when they get injured, they don't want to go to the hospital because the police is called. So they go to the clinics. So we need to think about this as a much bigger ecosystem. And for us, even though our programming, a lot of it's based in the school, it's perceiving the school as an infrastructure, as a center of community, but by no means can we only work with students. It's just, it's too complex, it's too profound, and there are too many amazing opportunities to engage others in addressing these challenges.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to zoom out now and think a little bit about how, you know, the lessons that you both have learned from your work in Central America can be applied and can be thought about sort of when we're thinking about violence and humanitarian issues globally or perhaps in other contexts. But Roberto, how do you see your work and sort of what you've learned, you know, connecting to other regions of the world? You mentioned as a journalist, you've traveled to other parts of the world and done reporting. How can we sort of think about, you know, some of the solutions that you both have been speaking about and issues that we need to keep in mind? How is that relevant to wider issues when we're talking about the global humanitarian sphere?
Yeah, I think that's why I was mentioning earlier the trend towards urbanization in the world, right? We're now a predominantly urban world. So wherever you are, the cities are coming your way, and sprawl and all these different things that actually are the same things that caused coronavirus, for example, have also caused like the birth of social conflicts. Like gangs come out of what I would call humanitarian deserts, right? I, was just listening to Selena, and I was like, I'm just remembering my own journey as someone who grew up in a difficult household and rebelled and became violent and engaged in criminal activity. And that in turn, and the Salvadoran gangs in Los Angeles were an expression of the humanitarian desert that became Los Angeles as reflected in the riots in 1992, where deindustrialization, and so deindustrialization, climate change, increased urbanization are going to bring these issues your way if they're not already there. And so the way what I do and what we do is I think we need to be clear about the intergenerational nature of these issues. We have to be clear about kind of interdisciplinary solutions that involve not just one. We can't just focus on trauma. We have to focus on education, jobs, training, tattoo removal, counseling, and simple things like public space to play, where we're diminishing the public sphere rather than expanding it as we're getting more urban. And so I think humanitarian organizations can play a role in promoting policies and helping build more places to play basketball or football if you're in America Latina, or cricket or whatever you play in the Caribbean and other places, right? So I think the promotion of the commons, of common space versus, because there's the enclosure of private space is worsening the problem when you don't have enough space or resources to share with the larger community that includes the poor. And so that's what I would say. I would say it's a battery of things. You got to understand the history. And lastly, I think there's a network of us around the world who actually do work on these issues. And I think that we are there for the larger global community to deal. I mean, we have a lot of experience here in the United States. We just don't know it because they don't talk about it. They only talk about the tattoo-faced gang member that you see in all those reports. When those of us that have worked with the gangs know the gangs no longer, their leadership no longer is the tattoo-faced gang member. That's an old picture that's still being used today. So I would encourage people to identify the right resources to really understand these issues.
And Selena, from you, what are some things that we can extrapolate from the work that you've done that can be applicable elsewhere in the world?
I mean, we're constantly applying what other people do around the world too. So I feel like there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination that we need to do. I think, and I think this is already being done, but there's a lot of similarities. There are also a lot of differences in terms of recruitment for different, different kinds of recruitment or groups. And I think when we think about young people and work with adolescents and positive youth development, there's a lot of learning that across, around the world you can really apply. I think there's a lot of learning around community building, like how to make sure everybody has a community that kind of every kid has a community that supports them and believes in them, even if it's not in their home. I think there's a lot of really important work globally having to do with gender and masculinities and what's expected of boys and men. And I think there's, in the US, there's been conversations about this. There's the Becoming a Man program and in Chicago, but also around the world. There are great ways to intergenerationally create positive relationships. So young people have a positive relationship with an adult, a caring adult. So there are so many approaches. And I know for us, it's important to look at what's been working in other parts of the world, because we do adapt that and we look at that in our context. And in peace building, in positive youth development, which is most of what we look at, because it's undoubtedly, I think young people who live in communities that have fewer resources, Roberto was talking about just humanitarian deserts, mental health deserts. I think this idea of there's this whole approach called crime prevention through environmental design. And we've been learning more and more about that and looking at how we do create public spaces that can contribute to positive development for children, for youth, for families. So there are a lot of approaches that we're learning from across not just the region, and I think it's particularly across the global South. I think we need to do a lot more learning across countries. There are a lot of learning from the US as well, but I think there is also a lot of learning from different parts of Africa, from the Middle East, from Asia. And fortunately, we're always trying to tap into experts and people the world that are looking at using surfing, ways to change surfing to look at. So I think these are actually cross-cutting global issues. I think all of these are issues that we're facing, and I think COVID has only escalated a lot of these issues. Intrafamiliar violence, for example, which is something, again, Roberto mentioned his upbringing. This is something that everybody in the world faces in their societies. So I'm always eager to be connecting with more people, because undoubtedly we need to address this across the map and working through these complicated systems. Roberto and you both mentioned these are structural issues. They're systemic issues. We want to, we're working. Roberto mentioned employability. I say a community of practice, like we at Glasswing do it, but there are so many other organizations. When you're trying to get someone a job in a place where there's so much unemployment, and this is pre-COVID, how do you convince someone to hire a person that's either coming out of the, justice system, prisons? How are you going to justify that they should hire them over someone who finished college and can't get a job? So there's a lot that needs to happen, and whether that's innovation, entrepreneurship. And I think that's where we need to cross-pollinate a lot more and also start changing the way people think. You know what? You're going to hire that person because that person has a different kind of human potential that may actually, they may end up being a better employee for you. Or, just even in the entrepreneurial and innovation space, I think there's a resourcefulness that you can get from leading a life of adversity that you can't learn otherwise. Like I didn't grow up like that. I'm not going to have that natural resourcefulness that someone's going to have that's had to survive, right? That's had to survive their whole life. So that's where I think those learning, at least I know, have been really valuable for us. And we also try to share what we've learned in our implementation, and then with our research partners, what they've found when they evaluate the work.
Thank you so much, Selena and Roberto, for joining us today. This was excellent, and I really learned a lot from both of you. Thank you so much for tuning in.
So that was a great conversation, Teresa. I learned a lot from Selena and Roberto and from the whole conversation, the way it evolved. I'm just curious from you, what were some of the big takeaways?
So for me, it was really interesting to hear about the historical perspective of this issue of gang violence, and hearing both a personal story from Roberto. Obviously, he's extremely passionate about the turns that his life has taken and the way that he has come out of that. And then hearing about the work that Selena is doing on the ground with Glasswing, with youth, like Roberto, who grown up in societies where trauma is unfortunately the norm. And hearing from both of them sort of how all of these issues interplay, they really cannot be disconnected. And I think that listening to the work that Glasswing is doing and how they're really able to target kids, is an excellent way to think about this issue in a humanitarian sphere. And again, it just reminds me how connected this is to all other humanitarian issues, because if you don't have a secure society, if kids don't feel safe going to school, you can have some great humanitarian interventions happening in schools. You can be training teachers, you can be implementing programs. If kids can't get there because they can't cross the street, it's not going to matter.
You're absolutely right. And I think it does connect as well to some of the broader ways that we're beginning to change our thinking in the humanitarian sector. It's been part of our conversation series so far about decolonizing development, really looking at where are the voices on the ground and empowering people on the ground to solve these problems in their own community. If you understand the root causes of something like gang violence, it makes you realize this is not something we can solve from a distance or from abroad. It has to be solved by the communities themselves. We need to give them the tools and the resources to do that. I think that's an important call to action and takeaway for me. And then the idea that in the end, the humanitarian system is only going to be as strong as the communities themselves, and the systems that we build around it, the innovation that's coming, including like getting funding directly to those communities, is going to be more and more important. And I think a conversation like yours just highlights that.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm so glad you brought up that funding piece, because that really is key. When we're looking at this issue, you're right that the local organizations really do the best work on this. They know the communities, they grew up in the communities, they understand the society, they know everything about the pressures that are related to this. But they do face major fundraising challenges, right? It's obviously easier as a massive international NGO to raise funds, to get funds like from major donors like the US or EU or whatever. But, these are the organizations that we really should be funneling the money to, because they really know what they're doing and they're having an impact on the ground.
Yeah, and these are the themes we've talked about in this conversation series. If you haven't seen this yet, when watching this, I recommend you go back and check them out. We've gotten into decolonizing development. We've talked about how new financial technology tools are allowing for different approaches to humanitarian work, including getting money directly to people who need it. And now here we're having this conversation that I think has really illuminated the issue of gang violence, what it means in Central America, but much more broadly, and hopefully gives us a way of seeing the humanitarian challenges that countries like these and societies like these face in a new light. So I really appreciate, Teresa, you bringing this conversation to the series, and thank you. And I want to mention now to everyone else who's watching that we're going to hear now from somebody who works on these issues every day at the Hilton Foundation. And I'm pleased to welcome to the conversation Angelique Mutombo, who's a senior program officer for the Catholic Sisters Initiative at the Hilton Foundation. And she's going to be in conversation with Marshall Stowell, who's the Vice President for Communications and Partnerships at the Foundation. Eager to hear from them now.
Thanks, Raj. It's great to be here today. Hi, Angelique. I'm curious as to your thoughts on this discussion. What stood out to you from today's conversation?
Wow, Marshall. Today's discussion was really, really riveting. I think Selena and Roberto really did a good job of drawing out the importance of community and the role community plays in supporting young people so that they can get out of like this cycle of violence. Another thing that really stood out was, the role stigmatization plays for people, and the importance of hope I think in my work with Catholic sisters, I encounter sisters, I interact with young people in their communities, and we always, underplay the role that the trust and the hope that sisters bring to these communities.
And you mentioned the Foundation's Catholic Sisters work, and I have a history in global development, and the Catholic Sisters funding by the Hilton Foundation is probably only behind that of PEPFAR and the Global Fund, and for good reasons. The work that sisters do around the globe is really based on compassion, but also on health education, and also trauma-informed work in recovery and rehabilitation, which I think both Roberto and Selena talk about.
Great.
So a couple of things that Selena mentioned that really resonated with me is that healing and community are critical, and we can't punish or police our way out of this issue. The second is pairing brain science on trauma and violence with approaches that address people as people is a solution that actually works. And then the story she tells about the adult-driven randomized control trial, and then at the last minute they stopped and asked young people, what's a motivating factor out of violence? And the kids said hope, and it wasn't a factor that they had even thought of. And it was a good reminder that when we deeply engage the people that we're trying to serve in program design, the design works better and actually speaks to the audience. So those were 3 points that Selena underscored that were really powerful to me.
It was amazing because that part of the conversation also struck a chord with me. People who experience violence actually are 5.5 times more likely to perpetrate it as well. I think when she was talking about feelings as well, we try to not talk about, the traumatic experience and the feelings. And I feel like, sometimes we just want to sweep the experience under the rug and not talk about how that person felt. And I felt like the work that they're doing is really centering on the person and bringing that human dignity, that you're human, you have feelings, you're not just a case or a number for them. So I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Roberto said a couple of things that I think are worth repeating. And the first is understanding history and context, that we need to take a good look in the mirror to see what role that we've played, from policies to policing to parenting to funding in these issues. The second being taking a multidisciplinary and intergenerational approach, that there's not one solution that's going to fix this, that you need to consider things that Homeboy does, for example, like tattoo removal, job training, education, counseling, really wraparound services, and treating people as people. And then the last thing that he said, which was really interesting, is that as the world becomes more urban, people live in cities more, these problems will become greater. And so there seems to be a much greater sense of urgency than what's being talked about to address these issues.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Marshall. On October 4th, the Pope brought out his encyclical, which is a Fratelli Tutti. And he really talks about, the brotherhood and caring for one another. And I think it's a really interesting piece of work that will carry our work forward in how we address trauma in a community, how we address migrants and people who are poor. It's a continuation of the first encyclical that he did in 2015 that talked about care for the environment. And a lot of times we do not really link the environment to what's going on in urban spaces, in rural spaces. And Roberto did a really good job of talking about this because we don't usually make those linkages. And I thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
It's a point that can't be underlined enough. And I think, funding structures from government usually look at humanitarian aid and then foreign aid separately. But with climate change, with things happening, the merging of those is getting cloudier. And it's probably time to rethink whether those vertical structures make sense in today's world.
I think it's obvious that it doesn't work. It's obvious that we need to look at things in a systematic way and not in silos, making sure that everything that we're doing is thought through from beginning to end, and really putting the person, people at the center, because especially the poor are disproportionately affected. And if we don't take that into account, we're going to just miss the plot, you know? I think we need to care for creation, we need to care for people and restore their dignity. And I think Homeboy Industries does this so well in their work.
The the three conversations that are leading up to the prize event on October 23rd, from the first decolonizing aid to putting more financial control in people's hands to today's discussion on gang violence as a humanitarian issue, reminds us of a couple of things. And that's, how can we put local organizations in the driver's seat, and how can we fund more locally than we have in the past? And then, how does technology amplify one's own agency? And then, if we can shift from a service model that treats people as problems to one that treats people as people, we're going to have greater impact. And for me, the underlying factor in all of this is, how do we as philanthropy, as development actors, ensure that people with lived expertise are seen, they're heard in their own voice, advocating for their own needs, and have a meaningful place at the tables where decisions are made, funding decisions, policy decisions. So this is really a conversation about shifting and sharing power.
Yeah. No, it's really true. I think of the sisters in the Akweka region, the Association of Consecrated Women in East and Central Africa, and the work that they're doing, for example, on human trafficking. We're talking about gang violence, but human trafficking is also a result of this urbanization and globalization that we're all having to deal with. And the sisters are really at the center. They have a network. They're really at the center of the work and supporting people. And they have a project on livelihoods now to be able to help young people, because even if they're migrating, we need to be able to have them employed, have them doing something, feeling useful, or like that they're bringing something to the world, right? And so the foundation's work in supporting sisters has really been to elevate the human development piece of the work that sisters do. And I think it's really important, livelihoods, making sure that the person sees value and in the work and what they have to bring to the world.
Angelique, thank you for joining me in talking through this important discussion today. And I hope folks will join us on October 23rd for the official Hilton Humanitarian Prize event.
I want to thank Angelique and Marshall for that conversation. It's a great way to close out this conversation series on the future of humanitarian action, writing the next chapter, which is really the broader theme this year for the Hilton Humanitarian Prize, the world's largest humanitarian prize, a $2.5 million award this year awarded to Homeboy Industries, an organization that works very much on issues of gang violence, but in the United States and as part of a global network all over the world. If you want to learn more about this and you want to tune in to a really exciting conversation with people at Homeboy Industries and a number of big names, from Brian Stevenson to Soledad O'Brien, who are going to be part of the Hilton Humanitarian Prize, I highly encourage you to check out hiltonprize.devex.com, where you can learn more about it. Follow us on Twitter, #HiltonPrize, and tune in. It's coming up this Friday, the 23rd of October, a really exciting prize ceremony, virtually brought to you from all over the world, and it's going to be exciting. Be there.